On April 5, 1909, readers of the Arizona Gazette opened their newspaper to an astonishing front page. Under a long headline about explorations in the Grand Canyon, the paper told them that a great archaeological discovery had been made deep inside the canyon walls. According to the story, an explorer working under the Smithsonian Institution had found the entrance to an enormous underground system, thousands of feet above the Colorado River. A hand-cut citadel of tunnels and chambers reaching back into the rock for miles. And inside, the paper said, were wonders. Passageways lined with rooms, copper weapons and tools, a great idol seated cross-legged like an Eastern god, tablets covered in unknown hieroglyphs, and in a side chamber, rows of mummies laid out in the dark. The story named the explorer a man called G. E. Kincaid, and it named the scientist leading the dig, Professor S. A. Jordan. It declared that Egypt and the Nile and Arizona and the Colorado would be forever linked. It was one of the most extraordinary claims ever printed about North American archaeology. And more than a century later, people are still arguing about it. So what was really in that 1909 story, and why, after all this time, will it not go away? To follow that question honestly, we have to start with the document itself, because unlike most of what gets said about this story, the article is real, and we can read exactly what it claimed. The Arizona Gazette was a Phoenix newspaper, and the story it ran that April day was long and detailed, written as a first-person account from the explorer himself. In it, the man called Kincaid describes traveling down the Colorado River and spotting, high in the canyon wall, stains on the rock in the mouth of a tunnel that could only be reached by a difficult climb. Inside, he says, he found not a natural cave, but a worked one, a vast system of passages cut by human hands, with a main corridor running back into the rock and smaller chambers branching off it. He describes a central room with a great figure seated cross-legged holding what looked like a lotus, resembling the images of the Buddha in the East. He describes rooms he calls granaries, still holding traces of seeds. He describes copper implements hardened in some lost way, and gray metal that might be a kind of alloy. He describes tablets and walls covered in a strange writing, part hieroglyph and part unknown symbol. And he describes a crypt, a chamber where mummies were tiered one above another, each wrapped and laid out, so many that the explorer says he did not care to count them. The article piles on the kind of detail that makes a story feel real. It gives the great central chamber dimensions. It describes urns and cups of copper and gold, a dull metal that resists identification, and hieroglyphs that no one present could read. It even reports a chamber the explorers did not enter, sealed off, from which a poisonous air seemed to seep, so that the account leaves a locked door at the heart of the mystery, a door conveniently impossible to check. The whole thing is written with the confident texture of a real field report, full of measurements and materials, and the modest hesitations of a careful man. And it credits the entire enterprise to the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, under the direction of Professor Jordan, which lends it the authority of the most respected scientific body in the country. Read cold, more than 100 years later, it still has the power to make the hair stand up. It reads like the discovery of the century, and the story goes further than a single cave, because it reaches for a sweeping conclusion, the kind that turns a local discovery into a rewriting of world history. The clear implication of the article is that this underground citadel was built by a people who came from the Old World, from Egypt or from the Orient, an ancient civilization that somehow crossed to America in the deep past and carved a fortress into the wall of the Grand Canyon. This is the part that has kept the story alive for a century, because it is not really a claim about one cave. It is a claim that the accepted history of the Americas is wrong, that a lost Old World people were here long before Columbus, and that the proof is hidden in the most famous canyon on Earth. And there is one detail about the real Grand Canyon that seems, at first glance, to back the whole thing up. If you look at an official map of the canyon, you find, scattered among its great stone buttes and pinnacles, a startling set of names. Isis Temple, Osiris Temple, the Tower of Ra, Buddha Temple, Shiva Temple, Egyptian gods and Eastern gods, written right onto the map of the Grand Canyon, exactly where the story says an Egyptian and Asian civilization once lived. To a believer, that looks like corroboration hiding in plain sight, and the coincidence is sharpened by the fact that several of these Egyptian-named buttes stand in the same rugged stretch of the canyon where the story vaguely places its cave. The map seems to whisper that someone, long ago, knew what was down there and quietly labeled the monuments after the gods of the people who built them. It is a genuinely seductive thought, and it is one of the main reasons the story has held on, and that is precisely where an honest documentary has to stop, slow down, and start actually checking. Because this is the point where the whole thing begins to come apart. If you enjoy slow documentaries that take a famous story seriously enough to really test it, rather than just repeating it or mocking it, consider subscribing, because it genuinely helps these longer videos reach the people who like them. Because when you go looking for anything behind the 1909 article other than the article itself, you find nothing at all. Start with the two men at the center of it. The story rests entirely on the explorer G.E. Kincaid and Professor S.A. Jordan of the Smithsonian. So the obvious thing to do is to look for them. And when researchers have searched the records, the result is the same every time. The Smithsonian Institution has stated plainly that it has no files for a Professor Jordan, none for a G.E. Kincaid, and none for any Grand Canyon excavation matching the account. There is no record of the expedition, no record of the funding, no record of the men. Beyond the newspaper story, there is no independent trace of Kincaid or Jordan doing anything, anywhere, connected to this discovery. The most famous archaeological find ever claimed for North America produced not one artifact in a museum, not one scientific paper, not one photograph, not one follow-up story confirming it, not one other newspaper picking up the greatest scoop of the age. It appears, fully formed, in a single article, in a single paper, on a single day, and then it simply stops. That is not what a real discovery of that magnitude looks like. That is what a newspaper sensation looks like. In that era, papers routinely ran spectacular, loosely sourced stories to sell copies, and a vivid tale of Egyptian mummies in the Grand Canyon, told in the explorer's own thrilling words with no way for a reader to check it, is a nearly perfect example of the form. Look closely, and the tells multiply. The professor is given only initials and a surname, S.A. Jordan, with no first name, no history, no other work to his name, a scientist who exists nowhere but in this one story. The explorer, Kincaid, is equally weightless, a man who claims the find of the century and then vanishes from the record entirely. There are no photographs, though the story is set in an age of cameras and of expeditions that photographed everything. There is no map, no sample, no artifact sent east, no telegram to a university, none of the trail of paper and objects that any real excavation of that scale would leave scattered behind it. And the era itself was hungry for exactly this. The late 1800s and early 1900s were the golden age of a now discredited idea that all the world's great achievements trace back to a few old world civilizations, especially Egypt, which supposedly seeded wonders everywhere from Mexico to the Pacific. A story that planted Egypt inside the Grand Canyon was telling readers precisely what a certain fashionable theory of the day already wanted to hear. The honest conclusion, the one the evidence forces, is that the 1909 story is almost certainly a hoax or a piece of sensational fiction, and that no underground Egyptian citadel exists in the Grand Canyon. But a fair documentary has to answer the believer's best argument, not just wave the story away, and the believer has a comeback ready. What if, they say, the reason there is no record is that the record was destroyed? What if the Smithsonian found the cave, realized it overturned everything, and buried the evidence to protect the accepted story of history? This is the famous Smithsonian coverup theory, and it is the engine that keeps the whole thing running, because it turns the complete absence of evidence into proof of a conspiracy. The trouble is that it asks you to believe something far larger and far stranger than a newspaper hoax. It asks you to believe that a scientific institution not only hid a discovery, but erased an entire expedition, 2 named men, all their equipment and funding and correspondence, and did it so perfectly that not a single competing museum, university journalist, or foreign scholar ever caught wind of the greatest find in the history of archaeology. It asks you to believe that everyone stayed silent for over a century, for no clear reason, since a genuine Old World presence in America would be the career-making discovery of a lifetime for whoever proved it, not something scientists would rush to hide. A cover-up that total and that pointless is far harder to believe than the simple explanation that a newspaper printed an unverified story and no cave was ever there, and the seeming clue on the map dissolves the moment you check it too. The Egyptian and Eastern names on the Grand Canyon, Isis Temple, the Tower of Ra, Buddha Temple are real, but they have nothing to do with any lost civilization. They were given in the late 1800s by geologists and mapmakers, including the geologist Clarence Dutton, who looked at the canyon's great isolated buttes, thought they looked like vast temples and monuments, and reached into the mythologies of the whole world for grand names to match their grandeur. The names describe the shapes of the rocks and the romantic imagination of Victorian surveyors. They are not evidence that anyone from Egypt was ever there. And here is where the story does real harm, and where it deserves not just correction, but a firmer kind of respect for the truth. Because the fantasy does not fill an empty canyon. It paves over a real and sacred one. The Grand Canyon is not a blank stage waiting for a lost old world race. It is, above all, a profoundly sacred place to the Hopi and to other native nations of the region. In Hopi tradition, the Grand Canyon is bound up with the emergence of the people into this world, and a sacred site within the canyon is understood as the very place of that emergence, a place of origin and return of the deepest importance. The Hopi and their ancestors have a long and genuine history in and around the canyon. And the region holds real archaeology, the dwellings, granaries, trails, and artifacts of Ancestral Puebloan and other native peoples who actually lived there. A heritage that is documented, studied, and true. That real record is astonishing in its own right. Tucked in caves in the canyon walls, archaeologists have found small figurines of animals made from single split willow twigs, carefully folded into the shapes of deer and bighorn sheep. And some of them are around 4,000 years old, left by people who used the canyon long before the pyramids of Egypt were even old. Along the ledges are the stone and mud granaries where ancestral Puebloan farmers stored their corn, and across the country runs the Hopi Salt Trail, a sacred route down into the canyon that the Hopi have walked for generations to gather salt and to pray. None of that needs a lost Egyptian citadel to be extraordinary. It is the true deep history of the place, and it belongs to native people. When a story insists that the real builders of the canyon's past were Egyptians or Asians who crossed the ocean, it does the same ugly thing the old lost race myths always did. It takes a genuine native landscape and hands its history to strangers from somewhere else, erasing the people whose sacred place it actually is. The Hopi have asked, through their own cultural authorities, for restraint and respect toward the sacred sites of the canyon. Treating those places as the setting for a fake Egyptian citadel is the opposite of that respect. So the honest reckoning is not only that the cave is not real, it is that the real story of the canyon, the Hopi story and the ancestral Puebloan story, is being shoved aside to make room for a fantasy. And that is a loss worth naming. None of the small remaining questions change any of that, but they are worth being honest about too. We do not know exactly who wrote the 1909 story, or whether it was a reporter's invention, a deliberate hoax, a promotional stunt, or an exaggerated retelling of something ordinary. That minor mystery, the origin of the article itself, is genuinely unsolved. What is not unsolved is whether the cave exists. Here is what nobody who checks the record seriously disputes. The Arizona Gazette did run the story on April 5, 1909, and the article is real and can be read. It credited the discovery to an explorer named Kincaid and a Professor Jordan of the Smithsonian. The Smithsonian has no record of either man or of any such excavation, and in more than 100 years of exploration since, no underground Egyptian citadel has ever been found anywhere in the Grand Canyon. The Egyptian and Eastern place names on the canyon were given by geologists in the 1800s for the shapes of the rocks, not by any ancient civilization. And the canyon is a genuinely sacred place to the Hopi, with a real and documented native history. Those are the solid stones. Here is where the questions begin, and they are small ones. We do not know the exact origin of the 1909 article, who first told it, or why, and that little puzzle may never be solved. We do not fully know why this particular story, out of all the newspaper sensations of its age, took root so deeply and spread so far. And we cannot easily kill a myth that has learned to feed on its own lack of evidence, turning every empty search into proof of a cover-up. Visit the Grand Canyon today and you will find no Egyptian citadel, but you will find something better, a real and staggering landscape, sacred to living peoples, holding the genuine traces of the native men and women who lived along its ledges and in its side canyons for thousands of years. The mummies and the idol and the hieroglyphs were never there. The Hopi and their ancestors always were. History is rarely settled by a single newspaper, and some stories survive not because they are true, but because they are exciting and because no amount of checking can ever quite catch up to a good rumor. It is assembled slowly, one verified record, one checked claim, one honest correction at a time, and sometimes the most useful thing a documentary can do is take a beloved mystery seriously enough to show, gently and completely, that it is not real. The 1909 Grand Canyon story sits in that space. The article real, the cave never found, the sacred canyon still standing and still Hopi. The story was printed. The cave was not there. The canyon was never empty. Thank you for checking it with me. If you would like more of these, the kind that separate the real history from the fantasy built on top of it, consider subscribing, because that is exactly what the next one does. Until then, a question worth sitting with. When a single unverified story can outlive a century of searching and can push aside the true and sacred history of the people whose canyon it really is, what is it, in the end, that we are really so eager to believe?